Welcome back to Law News Network, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Heather Hansen. We're going to take a break from our Segura trial coverage for just a bit and talk about the Google memo that has been the talk of the town for the last week or so. A Google employee named James Damore wrote a memo about his take on diversity at Google, and specifically the differences between men and women. There's been a big push of late to push girls and women into the STEM businesses, and he had a take on it that was a little bit different. That memo had been out for a while, and then it was leaked to the media, and all hell broke loose. Mr. Damore was fired, and there's been a lot of talk about it lately. I wanted to bring on our next guest. Jaime B. Hansen has worked in the tech industry for more than 10 years. She has worked at Yahoo, Fox, and Cornerstone. She's also the author of this fabulous book. It's called Expanding the Conversation. I think we have a picture of the cover to put up for you. That Expanding the Conversation, because real leaders leverage gender differences to create a competitive advantage in business. So welcome, Jaime. Nice to have you here. Jaime also happens to be my sister-in-law. So we talked about, as soon as I read about this Google memo, Jaime, I wanted to get your take on it. And when you initially read it, I know you've read it a number of times, as I have. When you initially read it, what did you think?
Initially I thought it was interesting. I thought it was very thoughtful. It didn't come off to me like a rant, like I didn't think he was being malicious or sexist or trying to be mean in any way. I thought it was thoughtful, but certainly a different take on some of the subject matter that's been out recently.
Yeah, and let's talk about that. I think that the word thoughtful is the perfect word, because he had citations to it, he had graphs. I mean, he had quite a thoughtful 10-page memo there. I'm going to show the audience the first clip of the memo that I want to talk about and put it up on the screen. And it talks about, it's going to be the first clip. It talks about, there we go. He says, I value diversity and inclusion, am not denying that sexism exists, and don't endorse using stereotypes. When addressing the gap in representation in the population, we need to look at population level differences in distributions. And then this is the line that I want to talk to you about, Jaime. If we can't have an honest discussion about this, then we can never truly solve the problem. I know, given the fact that your book is called Expanding the Conversation, I think we know the answer to this, but how do you feel about that sentence?
I 100% agree. I mean, I think he's absolutely right. I think we have to be able to have an open, honest, sometimes uncomfortable conversation about these things. And I think that's the only way we're really ever going to be able to move past, these challenges that have plagued us for a long time now.
Why do you think it makes people so uncomfortable? When you say sometimes uncomfortable, it is, and it clearly is. But why? Why is it?
Yeah, so stereotypes are tricky, right? They exist for a reason, and I think he does a good job of pointing out that we need to treat people as individuals rather than just a part of a larger group, which I totally agree with. But I also think, when you're talking about larger groups, you can talk about stereotypes as long as you understand that they're generalizations and not de facto representations. But, gender is tricky, right? There is a long history of discrimination and biases and negative assumptions and false conclusions, and with that comes a lot of sensitivity, right? And a lot of feelings, which is why I think it's an uncomfortable conversation sometimes where people get very defensive.
Deborah's here with me, another woman in a primarily male job. I think all three of us have sort of had that experience of being women in primarily male jobs. And I know you had a question or a statement that you wanted to add.
Just to add to that, sometimes I think it's a tremendous benefit to be a woman in a male-dominated field. I definitely think that I bring a unique perspective. And I'm sure we could all agree with that. I do have a question. I don't know what made this Damore an expert in organizational behavior, and I think that he neglects to bring up certain things like the glass ceiling, that there are certain factors that hold women back in the workforce. If they take it off to raise children, they're going to, that time, the similarly situated man can advance at a tremendous pace during those important years. And I think he neglected to bring that up. But what I want to talk about here is, that what about that? What can Google do? What do you have any suggestions?
What do you think about that, James? Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Heather.
No, go ahead. What do you think about that aspect of it?
No, I was going to say, I think that you bring up a good point in that it's not just like an uncomfortable, difficult situation. It's also a complicated one. And so he was thoughtful. It was a long 10-page memo, right? But 10 pages is not going to cover everything that is
Right.
included in this subject, right? There are a lot of biases that come in. There are a lot of cultural factors that come in. There is biology that comes in. But I think he brought in, he did, to your point, Heather, bring in evidence. And he thought about a lot of different things, but he brought in specific points of evidence.
That's
and
right.
he didn't necessarily bring in other pieces. And there's a lot of dissension and a lot of argument and a lot of like inconclusive evidence in this field. And that's where he didn't really address any of that or even acknowledge that. And that's where I think, you know, the level of tension has become heightened because he didn't address those things.
Well,
he didn't say, oh, I understand there are other sides we're not talking about, but in this conversation, I want to focus on this.
And that's the thing, I mean, as a lawyer, that was the issue I took with this. Two issues.
Yeah.
One is that there was no counter evidence, but two is that when we're having arguments in court, I don't say to the opposing lawyer, you're an idiot, leave the room. I say, what's your evidence? And here's my evidence, and let's expand the conversation, just like your book
Yeah.
says. So if he's fired for perpetuating gender stereotypes, that's the reason they gave for firing him. And Deborah and I are going to talk about the legal aspects. But how can we have this conversation without perpetuating gender stereotypes?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's hard, honestly. I mean, again, stereotypes are difficult. Gender is really tricky. You know, there's a lot. One of the things that he talks about at the end, he gives, I think, about like 10 different, what he calls concrete suggestions
Right.
of what, you know, specifically in this case, Google can be doing differently to address the diversity issue or how to look at things differently. And, you know, honestly, I agreed with a fair number of them. I thought some of them were really good suggestions. One of them I disagreed with was that he said that there's a need to de-emphasize empathy.
Right.
And to me, like, that's a problem because, you know, when you bring in gender, especially, we're talking, you know, about 50% of the population. There's a lot of feelings. There's a lot of backstory there. There's a lot of cultural piece, right? And again, there's going to be emotion. So part of, if you really want to have an open, honest, productive conversation, I think you have to be open-minded to the different sides of it. And part of that is absolutely like empathizing and understanding the different perspectives.
Well, and
so to
doesn't-
de-emphasize empathy, I do not think is going to help. I think it's the opposite.
Right, and doesn't that bring in what Deborah was just saying, that that's in many ways what we bring to the table as women in mostly male fields? Go ahead.
What do you think about him saying that only women value a balanced, fulfilling life? I mean, I think, how do you think that his colleagues reacted to that? That was primarily the issue here, probably.
Right.
Yeah, I totally disagree with that, and I actually think that that's harmful to both men and women.
Yes, a lot of these things that he said in here are harmful to both men and women. I want to pull up the third part of the memo that I sort of cut out, and it's a little bit longer, so we're not going to go through every line of it. But I want to talk about it because he talks about some of the ways that men and women are different, and I would argue that a lot of the ways where he talks about men and women are different are also ways where men and women both bring good things to a business. Can we bring up that clip, guys? The last part of the memo. No, that's not, it starts with, we can make software engineering more people-oriented. Okay. All right, let me just read parts of it then, if we can't bring it up, and then we'll talk about it. He talks about the fact that women on average are more cooperative. And we know that to be true, and it's the same thing as we tend to be more empathetic. Isn't that right, Jamie?
Yeah, theoretically, sure.
Well, tell me, I mean, when you say theoretically, do you think that that's just simply because it's the way that we've been raised, and so that
Yes.
will change? Okay, so
Yes.
How does that change?
So I do not think, I mean, is there a biological component? Like some would argue there could be. I think that is far more culturally ingrained in us than biological. But I think that I think empathy is an advantage, right? As is cooperation, as is collaboration. And so, like, to me, I think both men and women should aspire to be more of all of those things. And you can learn from each other. If you happen to be better at one naturally, awesome. Leverage that. Use that as a strength.
But what about women using we? That's a tremendous problem that women experience in the workforce, is that women are less likely to take credit. So that stops women from advancing, whereas a man is going to say, I did this, I completed this project, and not give credit to his peers.
What do you think about that aspect, Jim?
Yeah, so I mean, I think, again, are we discussing, is it cultural or biological? Like, I think that happens, absolutely. I think, like, an interesting question is, okay, how do we deal with that? Like, so to your point, like, if we recognize that that is likely something that's holding women back in business, how do we confront it? Do we, one school of thought is we need to teach women to be more assertive, to own their confidence, to say I instead of we, right? Another school of thought is like, okay, maybe we have to embrace what we is rather than I, and start, we've had a long history of men being the leaders in business. That's just history, right? So like we're all sort of indoctrinated in that's the way things are done, but that doesn't have to be the way things are done. And I think it's a big cultural shift to think of maybe we is actually more advantageous. Right. And we shouldn't be teaching women to say I, but we should be teaching everyone to say we, right?
Yeah, it's interesting. And one of the things that I read this weekend that I thought was important to discuss is there are other jobs besides STEM jobs and legal jobs and medicine jobs that are primarily men, and they tend to be the more physical jobs. So bricklaying, right, for example, primarily men, construction, primarily men. But there's an extra danger when it's STEM jobs that are primarily men. And you and I exchanged that article this weekend, Jaime, about the dangers of when it's STEM jobs, how that can then affect women going forward. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I mean, he actually makes a point in his memo that, again, I disagree with this. Like, he says that men are more into systematizing, and that could be a reason why they prefer these jobs. But, and again, I'm not an engineer, I'm not a computer scientist, but having spent a long time in tech, I can tell you that the purpose of writing code is not just to write a code. Like, that's not the end game, right? Right? The end game is about building and creating something and then seeing how people interact and respond and, build on top of that. So I think, and then especially as you get higher up, AKA like leadership, exactly what we're talking about, right? A lack of women in tech and leadership. It's about how do you put together both like the people and the things, the processes and the outcomes. And it's both of them. So I think it's not just one skill set in this case. Bricklaying, I don't know much about bricklaying, but assuming that the primary skill set there needed is strength, I think you can make an argument that it makes more sense to have more men in that field than women, right? But in other fields where there's a variety of skill sets and a broader array of strengths needed, you have to have complementary assets.
Well, and to get exactly, so complementary assets actually leads me into the next part of this conversation, which is that conservative and liberals as well can be complementary assets. And when we shut one part of the conversation up completely and say, you're not allowed to speak, please leave, we lose. It's the same as leaving women out of the conversation. And I do understand the argument that many women wouldn't want to work with him. But I think that, I don't know, I won't speak for you two ladies, but in my experience, I work with men who may have these opinions, but we talk about them. And sometimes I can actually make them change their mind.
Absolutely, and I thought that he brought up good points, that sometimes men are not allowed to say things that women can go to their employer and speak about, and that needs to be addressed as well.
Right.
Why is it such a one-sided argument?
Yeah, I agree, and I think that honestly comes from the leadership too. Like it's not easy. Like none of these challenges are easy, and there's a lot of feelings and sensitivities involved, but I think it's the leadership's job to kind of facilitate that conversation and to make it happen in a productive manner.
One question that Damore was asked in one of the interviews he gave that I thought was a difficult question, and I wanted to ask you about this, Jaime, because I know you have young girls. The woman asked him, what do you say to those young girls who hear about this, where you're saying that women are not biologically meant to do STEM work? What do you say to those young girls who say, well, then I'm not even going to try? And he didn't really, he talked about individuals, but how would you say that we should address that part of this conversation to make sure girls know that this isn't keeping them out of a certain field?
I mean, so to me, that's just a false assertion. Like, there is nothing in biology that says that girls should not be in STEM fields. That's like a very, very narrow point of view that, again, goes back to like systematizing in one aspect of a STEM-related field. So I think that's a very short-sighted, erroneous, and therefore dangerous conversation to have. Right. But I think that this is, I would look, again, I have two daughters, but I also have a son, and I think it's important for all three of them to understand, okay, I disagree with this. This is where I think he's wrong, and let's have this conversation. Let's talk about that, right? Like, use that as a starting point.
What I think is important to highlight is that in tradeswomen, workers, they have a lot of disadvantages. There aren't facilities for them. For example, there isn't a bathroom for women on construction sites. So there are a lot of biases that keep them from being able to go into that job. How do we address that?
Yeah, I mean, Jaime, is it culture by culture, person by person, or is it something that has to be handed down by the law? And Deborah and I will get into the law a little bit more. Do you think that we need the government to tell people you've got to make things equal in order to level the playing field?
So it's interesting. I have mixed feelings on this. In general, I think I actually don't believe in quotas. I think that they can be really harmful. I think in some cases they can be helpful, but I think if you like hold spots in this example, for a woman, then there's an asterisk there, right? And so it leaves everybody questioning: did she earn that job, or did she get it because it was the spot held for the woman and she was the best of the women, not the best of the best, right?
Right.
Which I think is harmful for both. But at the same time, I do understand that sometimes the means justify the ends, and there have been a lot of studies that show, especially overseas, that when X% is required to be filled by female leadership, that does change the dynamic.
Right.
And so, I think there's two schools of thoughts. I tend to fall less in the quota side, and I think there are other things we can do instead. But I do understand it. And again, I think this is all part of the conversation, is just trying different things. We haven't solved it, especially in the U.S. We have a lot more problems here, I think,
right,
that have not been addressed. And that's because I think we're limiting the conversation.
Well, and that's exactly why I wanted to have you on, because when they took him and fired him, they really limited the conversation, and I wanted to make sure that we didn't let it just go, because there's a legal aspect to that too, which I'm going to get to now with Deborah. But Jaime, I wanted to thank you so much for being with us. If you want to hear more of Jaime's thoughts on this or get the book, you can go to expandtheconvo.com. Get her book. It's really good, and it gets into these situations really deep. And she also has a blog on her website, so check it out. And thank you so much for Jaime for being with us.
Thanks, guys. I appreciate it. Bye.
So Deborah, I want to talk to you about the legal part of this, because when he was fired, I was like, gosh, everyone always says there's no First Amendment rights at work. And if you're an at-will employer, like Google is, you can fire someone for just about anything. But he actually has a legal argument here, doesn't he?
Absolutely. He brought this under federal labor law. And first of all, let's focus on the fact that federal law, you're allowed to talk about working conditions, and he did this in a forum that was provided by his employer. It's not like he posted this for everyone to see. Someone leaked it to the media.
Right.
So he was using Google's own mechanism to have this conversation. Second of all, in California, you can't fire someone for a political view. So he was taking a conservative approach and saying there's a left-wing approach, which is what Google is doing. Again, he's allowed to say those things.
Well, that's the part of the conversation that I think is going to be so strong for him, because in California, notoriously a liberal state, they have some liberal laws that in the past have protected people who have spoken out about legalization of drugs or gay marriage, and has said that speech is protected even in the workplace. But now you've got someone who's speaking out about a conservative point of view, and it too should be protected in the workplace. So the fact that he's in California probably gives him a stronger argument, don't you think?
Right, and also he's going to say that I'm being fired for being a whistleblower, for pointing out the issues with Google's own policies, and it does seem like some of the things he said are valid. For example, I believe that they have separate hiring processes where certain minorities are given additional interviews, whereas a Caucasian male, if they fail at one interview, they're not going to be invited back. But a similarly situated, let's say, African-American male comes in,
right,
they're going to be given a second interview. That's inherently unfair, and it violates federal labor law. So there are issues that he pointed to that I think have actual value.
Right. Let's look at clip number 2. This is a little piece of James Damore talking about the process by which this all occurred, and then I want to talk to Deborah about how this is going to impact his case.
I'm just curious if there was any, follow-up within the organization at the highest levels.
No, so I shared it with many of our diversity programs, and with individual Googlers, but no one high up ever came to me and said, no, don't do this. Even though there were many people that looked at it. It was only after it got viral that the upper management started shaming me. And
So Deborah, that I think is important. The fact that this was out there for a month, and actually the memo that we see is the result of him incorporating some of the feedback. But it wasn't until it got viral and leaked to the public that he was fired. How does that impact his case?
It absolutely impacts his case. That shows retaliation. Google's CEO made a statement that he violated the code of conduct, and that's why he was fired. I don't know that he violated Google's code of conduct. And I don't know that they were allowed to fire him for this, especially if he had good performance in the past.
Right.
I'm not sure about that.
Right.
And did they ever address the code of conduct issues with him? This was floating around for a while.
Well,
why didn't someone go to him and say, we would like you to take this down, we'd like to engage in this discussion, but this isn't the proper way for us to be having it?
Right, and that's the thing. I think that to engage in the conversation so that people don't feel silenced, because my concern is that when people feel silenced, they will go to places where they don't feel silenced, and that can be dangerous, as we saw this weekend here in the United States, where there's a lot of people spewing hate and causing all kinds of uproar. And so we really need to make sure that we are, when people are trying to have a conversation appropriately and using evidence the way that we do in court, that we don't just shut those people up.
The only thing that I think Google could argue is that it would make female counterparts uncomfortable to work with him. But again, they could have stopped this a while back and told him, you need to take this down. They could have issued a citation and then gone from there. You know, I take issue, as I said before, with him saying that only women value a balanced work life. Many of the women, like yourself, work incredibly hard. And then what about a woman's role at home? A lot of times the woman is the one that leads in the household and also leads in the child rearing department, which again goes to this glass ceiling argument that there are reasons why women don't advance when they should be. So I think he neglected to mention a lot of those things, but I don't think that this is a reason to fire him, especially given that it doesn't seem like any intermediate steps were taken.
Let's talk about what's really going to happen here. Chances are Google will probably settle with him rather than have this continue to be on the front page of the papers, don't you think?
Well, they've had some bad press about other hiring issues,
Right.
so I think that they have incentive, but I also think that the law might be on this former employee's side. Unless they can show that he really was a poor performer, that he was having performance issues right before he was fired, they're going to have to deal with the labor laws which protect him.
Right, and I think to your point too, if other women are saying he was treating me poorly, he was treating me as if I was lesser and didn't belong there, then that would certainly, the employers would have to weigh that.
That wasn't even what I was saying. What I was saying is that if his performance was poor, not in terms of how he relates to women, but actually if he was a good performer on the job.
Okay.
So that would come into play when determining how much he would be awarded here if this went to trial.
Right. Yeah, I mean, we'll keep an eye on this for you guys, because it is something that we're going to see more and more in these First Amendment arguments, and we often do see it. I know in the chat rooms you were talking about different people being fired for different things, and most of the time you see that employers do have the right to fire people for a lot of reasons. However, as conservatives start to feel more and more like they're being silenced, they may actually have more of an argument, especially under California law, that they can continue to talk and that they can't be silenced. Deborah, I want to thank you so much for your expertise in this particular area. We're going to switch back.
I would love to talk more about this. It's so fascinating.
It's an important topic, and I think it's something that the Google Manifesto has brought to the forefront, and a conversation that we should continue to expand.